What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. It's time to look back at the Big 12 and see which teams were better or worse than their records would suggest. Maybe see which teams were overrated and underrated, and I think this can tell us a lot about that, and maybe teams that are going to be overhyped and underhyped heading into next season. And so we'll start with what we learned from 2021 and see if there's anything here. And I tell you what, the Big 12 definitely told us a lot if you looked at the one-score games. If you go back and look at this, Oklahoma State, Baylor, Oklahoma, all really good in one-score games. Tells us that maybe they weren't as good as we thought. They just got lucky. And it's not luck, but they were just able to win some close games. All three of those teams underperformed this year. All three of those teams dropped off a ton. So I think you can definitely learn something from that. Iowa State was not good in one-score games, and they did not turn it around this year. In fact, they were even worse. So we did not learn too much from that one. Kansas State was 2-2. And then you look at Texas, 2-5. They really struggled in the one-score games. They had a much better record this year. They go from 5-7 to 9-3, or 8-4. And so, yeah, you could definitely learn a lot from the Big 12 games last year and how these teams performed in the one-score games. The teams that were really good and really bad. Except for Iowa State, that one really didn't play out. But let's look now to 2022 and see what we can learn. We start with the top 5 teams: TCU, Kansas State, Texas, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma State. Again, talked about Oklahoma State being one of those teams that was really good in one-score games last year. This year, they were 2-2, back to average. Texas Tech was 4-0 in one-possession games, meaning they're that team that is maybe overrated this year. Texas again struggled in the one-score games, but they were still able to have a much better record at 8-4. Kansas State was 2-2 again, and there's TCU. So TCU was 5-0 in one-score games. That tells me that maybe this team was overrated, and they did lose to Kansas State in the Big 12 championship. As much as I like this TCU team, it could spell bad news in the college football playoff when they play Michigan. Although Michigan was 2-0 in one-score games, so they also won a couple of close games. They didn't lose any close games. But if you add in the Big 12 championship, TCU would be 5-1, obviously. So that's the takeaway here. TCU, Texas Tech, are those teams overrated? And then Texas, are they underrated? Again, 2 years in a row. If they win the close games next year, could Texas possibly be a playoff contender? I'm not saying that. But if they are, then I think you can circle back to this and we could learn a lot from this. So how about if they had won all their one-score games? Well, TCU still would have been 12-0. Kansas State could have been 11-1. There's Texas. They could have been 12-0. Every game that they lost was a one-score game. Again, tells us that this Texas team is actually really underrated. Texas Tech, they still would have been 7-5, and then Oklahoma State could have been 9-3. Could have been a better year for them for sure. And how about if all these teams lost their one-score games, TCU would have only been 7-5. So you can see how some close games totally can change a season. And we had a lot of close games this year. But TCU, from 12-0 all the way down to 7-5, if you reverse all those one-score games. Kansas State could have been 7-5. Texas could have been 6-6. Still would have made it to a bowl game. And then there's Texas Tech, could have been 3-9. So from 7-5 all the way down to 3-9. And then Oklahoma State, they could have been 5-7. Could have missed out on a bowl game. So if these teams split their one-score games, and you know, the way we're doing it this year is if there's a half game, then we're just going to round it toward closer to what the actual record was. So TCU, for example, would have been 9.5 and 2.5, but we're going to round that towards what their actual record was. So 10-2 is a more accurate record for TCU and how good they really were based off of this. Kansas State and Texas, 9-3. Texas Tech, 5-7. So Texas Tech was lucky to even make it to a bowl game, and they went 7-5. So yeah, maybe overrated a little bit. And then Oklahoma State still would have been 7-5. So no change there. Now we go to these teams, and again, Baylor and Oklahoma were really good in the one-score games last year, and we saw them have a drop-off this year. Kansas, 6-6. West Virginia, just 5-7. And Iowa State once again struggled in the one-score games. Let's just look at this. 1-6. 1-6. So what's wrong with Iowa State? Why can they not win the close games? 2 years in a row this has happened. I'm telling you, that means watch out for the Cyclones next year. They were young this year. This is a team, I think early on we can say watch out for this team to get a lot better next year. West Virginia was 3-2. Kansas was 3-1. Oklahoma was 0-4. So they were really good in one-score games in 21. This year, not so much. And Baylor, kind of the same story. They were just 2-3. So if these teams all won all of their one-score games, what would the records have looked like? Baylor would have had a much better year. They would have been 9-3. Look at Oklahoma. They could have been 10-2. Kansas could have been 7-5. West Virginia also could have been 7-5. And there is Iowa State. Again, you win the close games. The Cyclones would have been 10-2. 10-2. So they would have been a top 25 team, a top 15 team probably, if they win all of those one-score games. Again, they were only able to win one of those. 1 out of 7. That is just terrible. And it's been 2 years in a row. So I'm telling you, if they get that figured out, if they can find ways to win close games next year, Iowa State's going to be a very, very dangerous team, a sleeper team for sure. All right, if these teams lost all of their one-possession games, Baylor would have been 4-8. Oklahoma still would have been 6-6 because they already lost all their one-score games. Kansas would have been 3-9. It would have looked more like what we expected from Kansas. West Virginia could have been 2-10. Could have been a bad year for them, although 5-7 was pretty bad. And then for Iowa State, it can't get much worse than 4-8. They just would have been 3-9. So again, you look at the best case scenarios, the worst case scenarios. How about if these teams split all of their one-score games? What would the records have looked like? Baylor still would have been 6-6, and again, technically they would have been 6.5 and 5.5. Oklahoma would have been 8-4, probably a top 25 team, but still nowhere near the top 10 or the college football playoff or even the Big 12 championship. Kansas, West Virginia, they would not have made it to bowl games. They would have been 5-7. But Iowa State would have. Iowa State would have been 6-6. So when you do the standings, you would actually have Iowa State ahead of Kansas and West Virginia. So this is a team that definitely was better than what their record would suggest. Oklahoma was better than what their record would suggest. TCU, Texas Tech, maybe not as good as their record would suggest. But again, there's a lot that goes into this. Some of the one-score games weren't really games that came down to one play, and it would be nice to have that information. I'd have to go back and watch all the games or look at the play-by-play. But, some of these games, a team could be down by 14 and score with 5 seconds left and make it a 7-point game, and it really wasn't. I mean, it was a one-possession game, but it really wasn't. So sometimes you can read a little too much into this, but like I said, with the Big 12, we did learn a lot from 2021. So this would tell me for 2023, watch out for Oklahoma and Iowa State to have big bounce-back years. Your thoughts on all this? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.